Good morning. Happy New Year. And hoping 26 is going to be a banner year, especially for Fender Real Estate and Neighborhood Tours TV. And I wanted to start off the year with a video on floods and primarily flood insurance. And you're like, yeah, that's a super exciting topic, but it's a big one, and it affects everybody. And it kind of came to me the other day because I was having a conversation with another realtor, and he made very light of it. I'm not going to say names or anything, obviously, but the individual doesn't do a lot of business. I don't think they do a lot of volume. And so they were guiding a customer through a transaction and never thought to even look into, hey, is this home that I'm about to put under contract for my client in a flood zone? Well, guess what? It was. And they didn't realize until further down the road being under contract, and it ended up causing problems because, as you know, if a home's in a flood zone, insurance goes up. It does make a big difference, especially if you've got to get flood insurance instead of just standard insurance if your home is in like a flood zone X and it's not at risk, which is what most people want is flood zone X, unless you're doing waterfront. But this wasn't. And so even in a regular residential neighborhood, sometimes you have pockets of like A, E, or A that can slip in close to an X, or come into an area that's primarily flood zone X, and you're not even expecting it. And as a realtor or just a person in general, like I've been in those situations where you go into a neighborhood and you're like, there's no way this is flood zone A or AE. Like it's got to be flood zone X. Like no flood insurance, nothing, no big deal. And then boom, find out, holy cow. So the tip number one is just, if you're a realtor or if you're just a home buyer and out there, make sure you do your due diligence. Look online, check the flood zones before you make an offer and find out what the flood zone is, and then call your insurance company, call your agent and say, hey, how is this going to affect me? What are my premiums going to be? How much more am I going to have to pay? So that's tip number one. To some of you, you're going to be like, yeah, no kidding, Dave. That's a no-brainer. But you would be surprised how many people don't think about whether or not it's in a flood zone, especially because a lot of times the neighborhoods just don't look like it. Just looks like just a regular old neighborhood, regular old home, and then you get a big fat surprise later. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is sometimes even if the house is in a flood zone X, the neighborhood itself can have problems. So just because your home isn't required to have the insurance, the neighborhood or the street coming in could potentially be problematic, especially certain times of year, especially if you're in Florida. There's areas in Florida that are just prone to flooding, and sometimes it's just neighborhood specific that is prone to flooding. So one of the things I like to recommend to people is when you get into that time of year where it's, raining all the time, and God forbid you do have like a big hit, maybe you get 1 inch, 2 inches, 3 inches of rain, and you just get a big ass flood, then, sorry for my language, then get out there and drive. Go take a look. If you were considering a neighborhood and maybe you just haven't, your finances aren't there, you're just waiting on something to happen before you can make that move, but you're like, man, I just really love this neighborhood, go drive it. That's my second tip. If you're not in a huge rush, but you are in love with the neighborhood and you really want to get into that neighborhood, and it's summer, it's the rainy season in your area, and you get a big downfall, if you've got, access to a pickup truck or maybe a Jeep or just a big SUV, whatever, something that's not going to get you in trouble, or even whatever, get in your car, but go, don't put yourself in a precarious situation where now you got to drive through water, but go check out neighborhoods, see, See what's going on. See if the neighborhood is potentially, a foot deep in water on the road, or maybe there's an area you have to pass through to get to the neighborhood you want to be in, and just see what it looks like. Is the drainage good? Is the county or the city doing their job? Is the water, dissipating quickly? Or are you driving by a neighborhood and like all of the lots are completely flooded and the water table's super high? And another thing that could hit really hard would be, you know, potential issues with like drain fields and septic tanks. I lived in a neighborhood one time, and the neighborhood itself didn't really flood too much, but the retention ponds would fill up, and then the surrounding houses around the retention ponds, because the grades weren't high enough, would have issues with septic tanks and their drain fields. And then all of a sudden, yeah, there was no water on the grass, and you could pull up in the driveway and everything was fine, but guy couldn't flush his toilet, couldn't take a shower, couldn't do dishes, laundry. You get the gist, but his drain field was backing up because the water table was so high. So it was deceiving is my point, So anyways, that's my thoughts of the day. Flooding, flood insurance, things to think about before you buy a home. And definitely questions to ask your realtor. If I'm not your realtor, hey, we're going to take a look at this house. Do you know if it's in a flood zone? Flood insurance required? Just a good question to ask. Hopefully they're just going to say, yeah, it's flood zone X, no worries, no concerns. But it's still good as a buyer to be smart, ask the right questions. And again, if you have the option of a vehicle or a truck, like a bigger vehicle, like a truck or a Jeep or a big SUV or something in the rainy season, yeah, get out, drive, hit the streets, and check out those neighborhoods you really like after a big rain and see what they look like. Are the streets flooded? Are the yards flooded? Are the neighbors having issues with drain fields backing up? So yeah, anyways, those are my thoughts. That's my first tip of the year for 26. And yeah, until the next one. See you then.